Welcome, everyone. This is our fifth seminar in the Digital Citizenship Plus seminar series, and it's the last one before the summer break. After the summer, we will be back in the fall with more seminars on issues around the impact of digital media on everyday life of children and young people, and on their development of citizens in an increasingly technology-intensive world and in a globally connected world. Today's topic is familial ecosystems and student well-being. And we will have one talk from colleagues from the DigiGen project in Europe, who will spend about 25 to 30 minutes on their presentation. And then we have a second talk from a colleague at the University of Hong Kong, who will spend around 20 minutes on her presentation. So the first talk is on understanding the effects of the family ecosystem on the lives of the digital generation, a case study of 4 European countries: Austria, Estonia, Norway, and Romania. And this presentation will be by the team from DigiGen and Dr. Olaf Capella, who leads the work of the Austrian Institute for Family Studies at the University of Vienna in Austria within the DigiGen project, who is also work package leader of the work package 3 in this project, will introduce their team. Dr. Olaf Capella is the senior researcher and research coordinator at the Austrian Institute for Family Studies at the University of Vienna, as I just said, and his main research areas are evaluation studies on family policy and children rights and child welfare, the development and evaluation of sexuality education programs and violence research. And he also works as a therapist and is trainer in several postgraduate training courses on health and sexuality education. So now I just pass it on to Dr. Capella. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for inviting us to share our first observation in the project. And I just share my screen that you can see it. And while I'm sharing my screen, I would like to introduce the project. This is a project which we have funded from the European Commission. And we have this case studies in 4 countries. And as Frank said, I'm leading the work package 3. It's on technological transformation and families. And we are focusing not really on children in all age range, but we would like to understand in terms of the ecosystem, where we do understand family as a central part of children's life. We do look at that family life, and we would like to see how the family life and children individuals are influenced, affected by the digital technologies. By that, we're focusing basically on 2 age groups. We're focusing on children between the age of 5 to 6 years and 8 to 10 years. And we do that by collecting data, qualitative data with children in these age groups, either by focus groups, where we concentrate on abstract and implicit collective orientations, in that to ensure intimacy for children. We are not focusing on individual experiences, and we don't want them to share too much of the family life. It's more to get a collective orientation, impression of what children in these age groups know about digital media. And then we have so-called families interviews, and in the family interviews with the same age groups, 5 to 6 and 8 to 10-year-old one, we're having 3 interviews per family. That's what we call family interviews. And since we are working with a very broad definition of family, so these interviews can be with a child, with an older sibling, maybe with father or mother or aunt or a good friend of the family, just to get kind of 3 perspectives on the family and their use of digital technologies. And we do kind of a triangulation of different perspectives to collect the data. In that work package, we focus very much on the topics, on the research question, kind of how is family life overall shaped by technological transformation? How do children use and subjectively access digital technologies in everyday life? By that, we're not only focusing what kind of devices do they know, but also what kind of technology, software do they use? What kind of apps do they use? For what reason do they use it? Then, of course, we are interested in harmful versus beneficial effects on the family as a system in terms of reconstructing family on an everyday practice and on the individuals. And then, of course, we would like to see, are there any differences in terms of diversity For Europe, we do want to look at that diversity in terms of different countries, different regions in Europe, but also different groups of people. And you will be a little bit presented in this presentation, and you will get some results. Sorry that we are here with such a big team, but since we are right in the middle of the field work, we have not the overall analysis. So we are in the middle of working on our data collection, and we just finished in most of the countries our field work, and that's the reason why I invited all the participating countries in that work package to share some first observations. This is not final results, please be aware of that. This is first observations of the data we are finding, and we would like to share that with you, and then we are very happy to answer questions and to get an exchange with you. And for the first country, this is not in by any way kind of prioritizing. I ordered the countries alphabetically. So happy we are starting with Austria, and this will do my colleague Eva Maria, who is working very closely with me in that work package. And some of the picture cards you see here, like this picture card, you see this were some kind of picture cards we developed for our field work for the children, and we are using them to discuss and to get into discussion with children. So by that I was trying to put them in the presentation that you can see them. Eva Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olaf. So just give me the next slide, perhaps. Then I can tell you some first results regarding the integration of digital technologies in family life, where we can see that there's a great variance across families. So what we could see across our 10 families, we have already that families integrate digital technologies rather from heavy using it, and are really proud in using digital technologies, and tend to positively highlight and glorify digital technologies in their daily lives. To rather families that are neutral and rather relaxed about how they integrate it, they do not make a lot of fuss about digital technologies, and are also doing family by using technologies together, by playing together, by sharing interests, having WhatsApp groups or communication groups, things like that. But we also find families who are really anxious, who are uncertain how they can integrate technologies in their daily lives. Parents who seem to be frustrated and highly skeptical how to integrate it, and rather tend to avoid or demonize the digital technologies. And regarding family practices, we have found some families where they oriented their practices rather towards their needs, individual needs, and also desires. Rather situative when using digital technologies. To families who are rather oriented towards a certain timing when using digital technologies, and rather restrictive rules. And that's the next slide. I would like to introduce some results regarding family rules we found, which seem to depend a lot on parents' assessment and on their educational style. So we found families who are rather highly restrictive and very concrete in their rules. Children also then know the rules very exactly. To families who define the rules rather in a vague and style, and rules are rather unpredictable for all family members. Families also sometimes are rather relaxed or desire-oriented and very situative. That's on the other end of the continuum. Children's perspectives on and their knowledge about rules seems to be rather vague on the one side and accepted among the younger ones. Among the older ones, we find kind of two groups. The group who rather understands and negotiates rules with parents and other family members, to the ones who rather ignore rules or try to oppose those existing rules they know. Rules might also be rather co-constructed among all family members, or compliant on the other hand. Regarding conflicts and challenges in family life, we see them mostly from parents or adults' perspectives, but not so much among children. Conflicts do not appear in their narratives or accounts they only talk about conflicts with children, but not so much with adults or parents. Only when they're taking over parents' role in a role play we are doing during the focus groups, for example. Yeah, that's so far from Austria. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eva Maria. And this was where Eva Maria stopped. That was kind of an interesting observation that we do find. Maybe this has to do with the developmental state of children as well, that they rather go not into conflict with parents about the rules. So, and we are still a little bit skeptical. Maybe this was too much we predicted or we expected that they would be more in conflict and negotiations, but we still have to see how the other countries, and that's something we will look at in the future. So I'm happy to turn to Estonia, and in Estonia, my colleague Marika Siaske will present the results of Estonia, and she's also co-work package leader in the work package 3 of our DigiGen project. Saskia, Marika, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So in Estonia, we made some general observations. The digital technologies are in Estonia really widely available across families with different socio-economic background, and also across generations within the families, children, parents, grandparents. And the digital technologies have really important role in families' everyday lives, even if it was not explicitly stated so during the interviews. But if you put the information in the context, you understand that it has a very specific role. Next slide, please. And two first observations we made based on Estonian data that really we are curious to go deeper in details. First concerns agreements and rules. And what about children as active agents? Because as we saw from the data, children and parents, they tend to have agreements about using digital technologies, but the rules are typically created by parents and not always negotiated with children. And it was quite obvious from the first sight in both age groups. And overall, children tend to accept the rules, even if they don't directly, even if these rules are not directly negotiated with them. So they don't argue very much against the rules. And the main and quite inflexible rule is a time limit rule. So poor technical rule, how much time can you spend watching the screen? And this rule may cause conflicts between children and parents. And what was also interesting that this rule, it could be negotiated to some extent. For example, as a reward for good behavior, this time limit rule could be disregarded for weekend or I don't know, maybe when parents wanted to do something else. And breaking the rule, it can be punished. And strict rules provoke cheating. So children start to find the ways how to not to follow the rules. And they also emphasize that their parents are doing the same, cheating. Next slide, please. And the second insight from the preliminary data observation is about harmful versus beneficial effects. What is it? Does what we see in the interviews refer to high awareness or moral panic? Children themselves emphasize that too much time behind the screen is A, bad for their eyes and brains, and B, may cause addiction. So they kind of know it very clearly. And the main activities of children while using digital technologies are related to entertainment, watching videos, communicating with friends, though mostly not for educational purposes or doing something together. And doing things together with other family members while using the digital technologies is much less prominent. So the interpretation of using digital technologies can vary greatly between families. And here are two examples from two different families. In one family, Two children were interviewed separately, individual interviews. A 6-year-old boy who said that my mom doesn't really let me go into YouTube. Well, because she says there are all kinds of foolish things on YouTube. And her sister, 8-year-old, says, Mom says, I can't be there very much because there are very stupid things. And I also think so, because once there was such a terrible thing that I don't even want to talk about it. But in another family, how mother reflected what they are doing together with children in YouTube. Well, YouTube I use often. Lately, we were learning with a child through YouTube because some things such as English language rules can be learned there nicely. We watch movies together and so on and so on. So these are two main interesting things that we have found until now, and I'm looking forward to go more deep into analysis and to publish the results. Thank you.
Thank you, Marike. It's great to see that some of the things come together in different countries, like what Marike said with that may cause addiction and bad for the eyes. And often we, even in Austria, we found families, or how we call it, who almost demonize digital technologies because, and the children, even the small young ones, they really know that and they really tell you about it, and that they sometimes really scare. And you even can see some kind of intergenerational transferring these kinds of ideas and thoughts, but that's something we have to look further on. And now we turn to Norway, and this is Tove, my colleague from Norway, who is together with Halla from the Norwegian team, and Halla Bjørn is leading the overall project of the EU project, and Norway is so-called the leading part of this overall project of DigiGen, and Tove is presenting some first ideas and first observations from the Norwegian team in Norway.
Thank you, Olaf. Our topic today is like doing family, and doing family expresses how family life is nothing static, but depending on how the family members interact and what they actually do together, how they organize themselves, and how digital technology is a part of that organization. So, and the idea of we-ness seem to be changing as digital technology become part of family life. And I will return to that later. But first, in the Norwegian families we have talked to, there is a large variety of how ICT is integrated in a family. And we can relate to how the Austrian team presented the different family types, moving beyond factors as socio-economic and cultural backgrounds. But in Norway, we find they are highly depending on the values expressed by the parents. So if I go to my latest point first, we can see one example of how values are activated when the families address what they do outside their everyday routine. Because in Norway, many families have access to a cabin or a small camping site in weekends or vacations. And almost all the families state that being at the cabin or being away from home together seem to stimulate the families to spend more time interacting with each other without digital technology as part of their family lives. Even though some of the families describe there is a slight change there as well, and they do see the need to bring with them or install Wi-Fi to secure internet access at the internet site or the camping as well. But still, digital technologies have less room as part of the family life at the cabin than it does at home. And then of course the question not yet answered is why, so that we have to examine further. But if we then return to the daily life, both children and parents are very much interested in digital technologies as tools and as entertainment. Parents are, of course, like mentioned from both Austria and Estonia, slightly more concerned than their children about how digital technologies affect them all. They do experience their own addiction to social media, email, and other content, and find it time-consuming. So they are very occupied with organizing family life in terms of balance. How much digital content they use together vary with the values presented, however. But they all express the value of doing activities together and being active. So related to digital content, many of the families tell us how they game together using gaming consoles like Xbox or PlayStation, or they use TV on demand, streaming, sitting together, having movie nights when they stay in. Outside, the phones are important when they are doing family. Not as traditional phones used to communicate or calling each other, but rather as small gaming machines, either as an entertainment for the children when traveling, or as part of doing something together like treasure hunts or Pokemon Go. What is interesting is that because of games like Pokemon Go requiring a phone, several of the families have given their youngest an old phone, not to call, but to be able to play on their own device. So in Norway, the terms being active together and at the same time having fun together seems to be important. Inside at homes, there are rules, like mentioned by Estonia. They are mainly based on screen time and age limits. Most parents are very occupied with talking to their children, however, about digital content and use. They differ, however, in how early they find it necessary to thematize different content their children can meet online. And in some families, this leads to how children have more knowledge of digital content than their parents are aware of, because the parent not necessarily know their children's experiences. And also the families express that there's a lot of things going on all the time, and digital technologies seem to be more and more normalized as a way of relaxing on your own. What we thought would be labeled as stealing joint quality time, actually by the families is described as a way of being alone and at the same time being together. Many of the families describe how it is okay to put on your earphones, listen to music, audiobooks or gaming, and at the same time sitting next to the rest of the family in the sofa. That's a part of doing family as well, even though they do not relate to the same content or interact with each other. I think I'll stop there from the Norwegian team. Thank you.
Thank you, Tove. This was quite interesting, and I think it's a very important subject we have to follow up. Is activities as a family with digital devices, is it considered as doing things together as a family, or is it not? So this will be some kind of interesting question we have to follow up. Let's turn to our last partner in this project, to Romania. And I'm very happy that Maria Roth can join us and that she will present some first observations from the Romanian team.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very glad to join you. I represent the Romanian team, as you said. So Romania is a highly polarized country, characterized from the children's point of view by diverse childhoods. On one hand, there is an intensive technological development today. So more and more children are accessing internet and have digital devices. On the other hand, there is large poverty affecting children. So 23.1% of Romania's children are estimated to be digitally deprived. From methodological point of view, this challenges a lot our work, because we have to cover by anthropological observation and interviewing a very large range of children and families. So from those best equipped technologically to those most deprived, living in very much impoverished families, for example, Roma, very impoverished Roma communities. This implies challenges for the researchers. On the one hand, we have to follow up the knowledge and the competencies of the technologically very well-dued and equipped children. We have to know what they talk about, to be aware of the sites they are looking for, the games they are playing. On the other hand, we have to be able to talk, to communicate with the Roma children who don't really know the language that we are speaking, or for whom the researchers look like strange people. They are not familiar with us. So it's very important to explore children's opinions by asking explanations and letting them take the initiative in conversation. This, we think, is a fruitful approach. If we do it in a way that children respond to us and communicate well to us, then we think that this research empowers children. Yes, so empowering children is one of the scope of the research. We do it so that we show them that we enjoy communicating with them and we appreciate very much their competencies. In such a way, we manage to increase their self-esteem and even to contribute to reversing their internalized stigma, which we can often see by Roma children. Thank you. Next slide. So for the results that we have obtained, these were very, very interesting things. So on one hand, we saw in all families, yes, we also respond to the question how these digital technologies contribute to doing families. What kind of specificities are there in doing families in these two categories of families? One, those who are technologically well off, and those who are deprived from poverty and also technologically. So we have seen that in both families, these gadgets, these digital devices become kind of vehicles of solidarity or of conflict, sometimes solidarity. So when one tablet is used by two sisters for one for her needs, while father is looking for work abroad, yes, then it becomes complicated. One sister has to work with the tablet for school. The other one, who is smaller, wants to look at YouTube and entertain themselves. So there's a continuous negotiations and establishment of rules and changing rules. Yes, for device time, for the space and the room where this digital communication can go on. On the other hand, we have noticed that for the children who become competent technologically, they are very much valued in the families. Children aged 8 or 9 or 10 who can help their smaller brothers and sisters become get a stronger position in their families. And she also becomes a help for her mother, who doesn't understand these technological issues, so she cannot help the smaller child who just get into the school. The other example is a boy aged 9 who sold his console and sold his telephone to get money for the needs of the families. And the stepmother, who has to take care of him and his smaller brother, are very grateful to him that he contributes to the needs, to cover the needs of the families. The same, the boy who is age 9, I told you, he plays with the smaller brother, takes care of him, shows him YouTube films. So he became some kind of partner for the mother by the way he can deal with the digital technology. So I think this was shortly the results from the Romanian team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. And for us, all other countries, it's very important and it's very interesting to get insights in very specific communities like Maria just shared. Like if you think about a Roma community where children using digital devices like you see on that picture, or if we have the use of digital device like on the other pictures. So of course, even in research German results, it may differ. So to the last presentation, we only focus not on the content, we only focus on the very young age of children. How can we work with focus groups and interviews with children in that age groups, because not very much research is done with these young children, and then invite Susanne Vogel to share our first observations.
Dear Olaf and Susanne, please wrap it up within 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'll be very quick. As you're all aware, we're making plans and then the pandemic happens and things change. So, for example, the recruitment through the institution, which we thought is a good way of going about and securing diversity in participants, suddenly became very difficult. This also affects the times and places we can conduct research. So just be aware that conducting focus groups or interviews in the children's bedroom, for example, which might be the only possibility you have, suddenly changes the power dynamic. I'm not qualifying positive or negative, but it is certainly a different setting than having an institutional setting. But even more important, it's more likely that you have parents present. We usually try to not involve parents at the same time with the children to make sure that we're hearing the children's voices and not the parents' voices. But of course, if you use the family home as a place to conduct your research, that's difficult. But interestingly, many of times we didn't see any negative effects from parents being present. This might also be due to the age of the children. I'm coming to the last point, diversity of opinions and social desirability, because particularly in the younger age group, 5 to 6 year olds, their opinions and their views are strongly related to the parents, obviously, because that's their environment, that's how they develop their opinions. And if you think that they're just repeating what the parents say, that's the part of development, you know, that's socialization in a sense. So that's not surprising, but still when they grow older, in the older age group, you already get a glimpse of how they embed the family views, the family opinions within their own experiences, and how they use this background to interpret what they do, how they do it, or what they should not do. So the social desirability, I would not call social desirability, actually, I would call it developmental similarity to the parents' opinion, probably. And just 2 short comments to wrap it up. Particularly in the focus group research, the moderator has to be quite central. He has to take a lead, or she has to take a lead, because the interaction amongst the children is limited. So you have to guide them much more than you would probably like to do in focus groups with older participants. And it also means that the group dynamic or the group interaction is again very moderator centered. There is not so much interaction amongst the children, but more directed towards the moderator. Nevertheless, there can be exchanges amongst the children, which are quite valuable. And the contradictions when you have friendship groups where they say, oh, but no, this is not right. This is something you only get with the younger children. Older children would be much more concerned of having a neat and shiny surface on their opinions, on the group of friends. And here you can have more open contradiction. And that's quite valuable, I would say. So just a short glimpse, there's much more to say, but no more time in this instance. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us so much time.
Thank you. Thank you for this interesting presentation on so many different countries and observations that you've made, and they seem to come together in some way. By the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning that anyone in the audience is invited to use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you may have or submit any comments that you think are valuable. And we will address these comments and questions after the second presentation, after the discussant's contribution. Okay, and the second talk now on student well-being during COVID, navigating through different phases of school suspension, will be delivered by Dr. Xiao Hu. who is an associate professor in the Human Communication Development and Information Science academic unit at our faculty here in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong. And her research expertise is in technology-enhanced learning, learning analytics, and recommender systems with an emphasis on collaborative learning and self-regulated learning. She's also a co-leader in the e-citizenship project here in Hong Kong. So Dr. Xiaohu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, everyone. Today, I'm glad to be here to present the student well-being during COVID pandemic. So this is the work in the work package 4 in the Digital Citizenship project here conducted in Hong Kong. This presentation is a collaboration with PhD student Ms. Molly Kong and also Professor Nancy Law. We will start from a little background, and then we will focus on the in-depth study during COVID, and we will end up with the next steps. So first of all, our work package focused on the context of students' learning lives. So our overarching goal is to study students' learning life across different contexts, including home, school, and community, and in between of them. However, in the middle of our study, we encountered the pandemic, which forced the school closure in Hong Kong and soon across the globe. So we couldn't continue the original plan. And we noticed that there is an urgent call to understand the impact on students' learning lives. So then we adjusted our work, and then we focused on the well-being and trying to do a natural study in the pandemic. So well-being is very important, as we all know. But then if we look at deeper, we found that there are so many definitions of well-being, and all of them are very good. However, we end up with figuring out it's a comprehensive concept with multidimensional elements. Therefore, we had to start with literature review and also a qualitative study on university students' well-being. So based on those, we formed up a multifaceted framework of school students' well-being. Besides the common components in many existing definitions of well-being, including physical well-being, psychological well-being, social well-being, and so on, we also added the digital well-being, which is a new demand for online learning and for social life nowadays. We also added academic well-being, which is the student version of career, work, or accomplishment. Those are components often mentioned in existing well-being framework. Based on that, we conducted an in-depth study on students' well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic. So as you know, the pandemic is so long and there are multiple different phases. So this study actually is a natural experiment. So we followed the three natural phases in the pandemic, particularly in Hong Kong. So the first phase was when the students were confined at home, they had to take online lessons. The second phase was when the pandemic situation was under more control. Then the students were allowed to go back to school and have a half-day school each day. The third phase was actually summer holiday, which was last year. So, but that summer holiday came earlier than usual because of a new wave of COVID-19 outbreak. For research questions, we have two. The first is how was the students' well-being in the three phases? And the second is to trying to explore the reasons for the changes of students' well-being in the three phases. As mentioned just now, it was very difficult to recruit participants for any study during this special time. So we used the purposeful and the snowball sampling and managed to recruit 22 students, 20 parents, and 3 teachers in this study from 2 schools, 2 local schools. The students were from forms 2 and 4. they were equivalent to grade 8 and 10 in the North American system. From this table, you can see the sample was largely gender balanced and form balanced. In order to obtain a comprehensive picture of students' well-being, we applied multimodal data collection methods throughout the phases. Besides the survey and interview, which are quite common, we also proposed a method called semi-automated day reconstruction methods, so-called DRM. It is used every day for a week in each of the 3 phases. This method involves multiple devices and instruments. So the Fitbit Versa is a wristband which can be put on the student's hand, and then it will automatically measure the student's physical activities as well as their sleep status. The students also did the daily report, which include major social activities happened in the day, as well as internet usage, which was basically reported by some apps like Rescue Time or Screen Time, which can report how much time the students has used in different kinds of activities using the digital device. The Blocky Time is also an app which helps the students to record their time usage during the day. So this part is not limited to digital time usage. So whatever they do, maybe having lunch, maybe watch a movie, something like that, they can use Blocky Time to record what they have done during the day. Last but not least, students did a small reflection every day to report the important experience during the day and how they think or feel. Teachers and parents are also interviewed. Teachers are interviewed twice in phase 1 and phase 3 on how did they do the online teaching and their opinions on online teaching. Parents were interviewed once at the end of phase 1. The questions were about how their children studied at home and their attitude towards digital technology at home. Here is an overview of the data collected. Due to time constraints, we cannot go into details of all those, but one thing that I want to point out is we use both objective and subjective approaches to study well-being, which is kind of the norm in the literature. So because well-being is very comprehensive. And also we, for all the instruments, well grounded in the literature. For the quantitative data, we mainly used the one-way repeated measure ANOVA to compare across the phases, as well as the post-hoc test, also compare between phase. And both of these tests were corrected for multiple comparisons. For qualitative data, which include interviews and reflections, we did inductive analysis. Here comes the results. First of all, mental and physical well-being. So in terms of the survey results, as we shown here, the mental health and the physical activities didn't show significant difference across the 3 phases. However, when we look at the data recorded by the wristband, the differences show up. And across multiple measures, phase 2 had more activities recorded, including a number of steps walked and the time for physical activities in different activeness levels. So for all of this, in phase 2 has a higher number, while phase 1 and phase 3 are more inactive. However, there was a different, exception, which is here, the sedentary duration. So across the 3 phases, students seems to be sitting a lot. And it was surprising that they sat for 14 to 15 hours a day. during the pandemic, regardless the phases. In terms of sleep, a lot of sleep measures didn't show any difference across phases, such as the total sleep time and so on. But the exception is deep sleep. In phase 3, students had significantly longer deep sleep. We also measured the life regularity scores, which shows that in phase 2, when students had to come back to school for half day of schooling, they had more regulated life. In comparison, during the summer holidays, their life was the most irregular. According to our interview results, it confirmed that the reduced physical activity in phase 1 and phase 3 could be attributed to the social distancing policy and also the living environment in Hong Kong. As we know that the residential communities in Hong Kong are really packed. So that means social distance basically means people cannot go out. And the public recreation facilities are mostly closed. So as students stated, like again and again, that they couldn't do anything except staying at home, which hugely limited their physical activities. In terms of the deep sleep, there is some literature that says deep sleep is related to rebound sleep. So this might indicate that students were actually sleep deprived in phase 1 and phase 2, which was not too hard to imagine in Hong Kong because students were really stressful during the semesters. And in terms of life regularity, we could attribute that to the school scheduled routines. Say in phase 2, the student has to go back to school and follow the school routines, so that they were most regular. And phase 1, in terms of life regularity, phase 1 didn't have much significant difference from phase 2. That means although the students had to stay at home, they had to do online learning, and in some way they had to follow the school routines as well. In terms of social well-being, this table shows the number of social interactions reported by students during the 3 phases, as well as the emotion associated with each social interaction. As we can see, most of the social events were perceived as positive or neutral, and only about 10% of those events have been perceived as negative. And if we compare across the different phases, phase 1 had the highest percentage of negative emotions, while phase 2 had the highest percentage of positive emotions. In case you are interested in, curious about what exactly the emotions was, the most frequent negative and positive emotions were anxiety and happiness, respectively. While the anxiety levels, the frequency of reported anxiety didn't change much during the phases, the happiness was reported as most frequently during phase 2. So the interview also confirmed the positive emotional experience when students had social events during the pandemic. This finding is in accordance with a recent finding on social connectedness protected against poor mental health during home refinement. The interview also revealed something on the relationship between social well-being and digital technology use. So basically, when students feel less socially connected, they will be more prone to internet use. Here comes the digital well-being. These are the time used on internet as reported by the students. As we can see in phase 2, those time would be the fewest. Especially on productivity-oriented usage of internet. So for students, productivity means learning. So this part should be because the learning activities happened mostly in school during the phase 2. But we can see that phase 3, all the usage actually increased, right? Including pleasure-oriented productivity and productivity-oriented usage. So in the interview, actually, we seeing a pattern that students mention boredom and internet usage. So if they feel bored and nothing else to do, they may tend to use internet more. So that happens for phase 1 and phase 3. Another finding is about parental roles for regulating digital devices. We found from students and parents interview that actually the parents seldom intervene children's internet use. Partially because parents were busy, they may not be able to stay at home at all, or some parents are concerned that their children are young adolescents, so they may be sensitive to parents' intervention. In terms of academic well-being, here are self-reported measures, including engagement, self-efficacy, and so on. As we can see, the highest scores happened in phase 2 throughout all the measures. Some are significant, including the self-efficacy. And we also observe an increase on agentic engagement in phase 2. Also, this engagement sustained in phase 3. So that means only in phase 1, the agentic engagement was not so good.
Dear Xiao, please wrap it up in 2 to 3 minutes.
Sure. Okay. So the interview indicates that face-to-face learning has huge advantages. Some students mentioned learning atmosphere at school, and some mentioned that they could get immediate responses from peers and students, which is related to their self-efficacy. And some students mentioned reluctance and difficulty in seeking help during the first phase because they didn't have much experience in online learning at that time. So this may explain the low agentic engagement in phase 1. And there are some other measures which didn't show significant difference across the phases, which might be related to the school's rule, which reduced the proportion of exams on the final score, which is very different from common practice in Hong Kong. So as a result, it reduced the anxiety of the students. So that might be part of the reason that students didn't feel too much impacted by the context. Okay, so here's the summary. So we find some changes of student well-being across the 3 phases in the pandemic and analyzed some reasons behind it. There are some implications for teaching and learning, including the risk of home confinement and the benefits of returning to school, even only half day. Also, the emotional value of social connectedness is very important for students under the pandemic. This study also shows a methodological contribution, which is the semi-automated day reconstruction methods, which could be more automatic, more accurate, and less intrusive. Actually, it's ongoing work. We designed and conduct a smart planning workshop for schools, and so we have done an initial implementation, and this is based on this finding that we try to help students to monitor and track their own activities and reflect for better planning. Okay, so that's it for today, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to announce that we will have Professor Dr. Sonia Livingstone from the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science as our discussant of the 2 presentations. Dr. Livingstone's research examines how the changing conditions of mediation are reshaping everyday practices and possibilities for action. Much of her current work is concerned with children's rights in the digital age. And she will spend about 5 to 10 minutes, I believe, on her discussion of the two presentations, so that we will have about 10 minutes for discussion afterwards as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be speaking to people in, I think, a number of countries and contexts. And it was a pleasure very much to listen to the two presentations this morning. I think we have really been taken in depth into the experiences of family life today, and gained a really complex sense of the nuance and the complexity and the variety of experiences that shape family life, especially during the pandemic, and that contextualize the role of digital technologies and the way in which digital media are becoming part of modern family life. So I very much enjoyed both the papers. The papers were in a way quite different in their approach, but also I think pointing to some common themes. So my remarks today are in part based on my own research, which I shall say a little about, but also on the basis of the core project that I'm part of, which is a European Commission funded project. CORE stands for Children Online, Research and Evidence. And together we, across Europe, researchers are developing a dynamic platform that is to provide coordination and support for cross-national research about children's online experiences, and to collate together the evidence base. So we are at the moment in the midst of reading so many different studies and thinking about so much research that is happening now, to understand the impact of technological transformations on children and youth from many different perspectives. And the idea is that we produce the evidence base of benefit for researchers. So I hope everyone will visit the CORE platform. And we are also producing the evidence to be useful to policymakers and educational actors. And I think it's an interesting question for us to reflect today. What are the findings we've heard that could be useful for educators, for parent organizations, for policymakers who have been orchestrating the family needs and support during the pandemic, for example, making these decisions about when children will be at home or when they will be able to return to school, and what support should be provided for different kinds of families and family ecosystems, as our first paper discussed. So I am very committed to the idea that the research will be of use beyond the academy and inform the decisions that are made to support family well-being. With that in mind, I just thought we should reflect a little on these ideas of family ecosystems and well-being, because that's what integrates the two papers. In the core project, I lead the theory and concepts work package, and there we have been interrogating some of the concepts that really underpin so much research in this field. And it's clear that well-being is one of those, and it's become quite a buzzword. People talk a lot about well-being these days, perhaps because there are so many threats to children and young people's well-being. We're talking about it especially, I think, during the pandemic, when there's a lot of reflection on well-being and what we want for children and young people and for families. So I invite us to think about the concept of well-being in relation to cognate terms like happiness or health or quality of life or life satisfaction. These have all been measured by social scientists and psychologists to try to understand them. Many different disciplines, in fact, have weighed in. And in the digital world, I guess the big question for all the studies to consider is what are we hoping for, and what are we worried about in relation to digital technologies that can enhance well-being or that might detract from well-being? And what is it that those stakeholders, parents, teachers, educators, policymakers need to know and need to understand about children's digital experiences so that we can work together to enhance their well-being? In the core project, under our kind of theory banner, we recently held a webinar on the nature of well-being, comparing perspectives from media and communication, economics, children's rights, and psychology and sociology. And I'll just use 3 of our conclusions to ask some questions, I think, back to the speakers today, and be interested in their reflections. So the first conclusion was the question of all the different conditions of children's lives and where well-being fits, and where the digital technologies fit. So how important are digital technologies to well-being by comparison with economics or quality of parenting or the nature of education, for example? The second question was to understand well-being in its negative and its positive sense. How much are we looking to find ways to stop the barriers to well-being? And how much do we look for positives of well-being? How can we enhance well-being, and what exactly are we trying to enhance? And then the third question we addressed was the question of how do we engage children in that process? And that raises some conceptual as well as methodological and political issues. And all the speakers had much to say, especially about the methodological issues. So in relation to if I can turn those 3 themes into questions back for the speakers. On the question of how multiple factors shape children's outcomes, what I appreciated about the first paper with its many authors was the emphasis on the family ecosystem as a key mediator of children's well-being outcomes, and also of the way in which digital technologies are incorporated into the family. So there was talk of the we-ness, how the we-ness of the family is changing. A lot of interesting evidence about what Catherine G has called joint media engagement, the way in which gaming together, for example, brings the family together. A certain emphasis on the idea of parenting values, which I also found in my own work on parenting for a digital future, where you could see how family values really shape media engagement. And in the second paper, I think a very interesting focus on the structure of the factors that shape children's lives over time, and how those kind of play out in different circumstances, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. You really see how these multiple factors that influence outcomes, including engagement with digital technology, are always changing, and the big structures in society make a difference to the family life and the everyday timetables of children. I think in terms of the overall kind of negative detractors and the positive enablers of well-being, I would have questions for both papers in terms of their tendency, I think, in some ways to conceptualize the role of parents as rule setting and kind of controlling. And I think there is some difference, in fact, among the different authors we heard. Some saw parental mediation primarily as about setting rules which children might break or exceed or accept. And some saw parental mediation more as a kind of shared and communal activity of negotiation and engagement. And I think there were some interesting differences there among the papers. I'm not sure how much we can map those onto different countries that we've heard about and different cultures that are represented in terms of parents, values and technology. or whether it's a matter of the different methodologies that the papers have used, because these were also very different. But I would be myself very keen to think about how digital technologies can support well-being in ways that go far beyond parents saying yes or no, or worrying about screen time and sedentary activity. I think it does raise questions about what we hope for. What does good look like? Is it just less screen time? Is it more in-person interaction with friends? Is that what matters? Are we interested also in how technologies can enable children as citizens, as political actors? Are there other things we might think of? And I think from my last point, really, from how children were then engaged and involved in the research, we could see potential for addressing some of my bigger questions about the factors that matter and the role that we want for children. So I think the first paper perhaps had more about children as active agents, whose voice can be engaged and who have things to say themselves about how they want what they value in their well-being and what they want for digital technologies. And I think in the second paper, we had more of a sense of the structural factors that constrain children and perhaps what they might think of those, and the limited agency actually that children have in the world, and the very real constraints when adults make so many decisions for them. So I think there are questions there about, you know, the dimensions of well-being, the role technology might play in inhibiting or enhancing what we really want for children, and how we bring in children's own voices. And my last question for the speakers might be, what do we do when we as adults disagree with child engagement and child voice, when we don't think that what they ask for, you know, how do we kind of get around that? I think I was thinking partly of I think the Estonian study that showed children feel themselves to be addicted. I would like to disagree with those children. It's just a case in point. I will stop there and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Livingston, for those interesting insights and questions, also for the presenters. Since we're short in time, I would like to first read 3 questions that we've received from the audience, and then I would like to invite the presenters to briefly respond to the questions really briefly, and anything they think is important to say in response to your comments. Okay, so the first 2 questions are for the first group of presenters. So the presentations from the first group has a lot of interesting first findings. Do you have a sort of general finding that you think is important across all the countries involved? And second, I would like to thank all the speakers for the interesting presentations. I have a question for colleagues on the studies done in the 4 European countries. I can see a lot of similarities across countries in terms of doing family and digital tech. I wonder if they notice any prominent differences. And the third question is for both presentations. Again, thanks for all the wonderful presentations. I saw somewhere in the news, not in the literature, unfortunately, that the online learning mode during the pandemic might be better for introverts who are less willing to take active roles in classroom interactions. And I wonder whether any of these studies have considered students' personalities as well. Thank you. So maybe the Olaf,
Yeah.
you can start trying to give a really brief response, and then
Yes.
pass it on to Xiao, please.
I try to give a brief response, and my team will try to continue. Maybe first to even Sonja's observation and to some of the questions. Those are not extra studies. Like all what we presented is done by the same studies and the same methodology. We are just doing it in 4 different countries. And so far, we have not overseen the interview, all the results, data results. But what we already see is in terms of methodology that we see working with so small children, as Susanne pointed out, in all the countries, we as researchers are challenged that we in the focus group have been much more directive than we are usually in qualitative research. Regarding well-being, I would say, to Sonja's question of mediation, of course, we do see that on the one hand, we see family with very strict rules, I think in all of the countries, and the rules are basically about the screen time, the time children spending on the digital devices. It's less, and this is also discussed in the literature, it's less on what they are actually doing with it. But what we all see that digital technologies has an important role in all of the countries in common activities of a family, and by that doing family in terms of we-ness, in co-activities, not only in activities when parents are present, but also in co-activities, but the different value sets. And I think we see that pretty much in all of the countries as well, that this is very much depending on the different value sets and how family is organized, and less depending on the country, but maybe more depending, and there do we learn a lot from Romania, maybe depending on the overall situation of the family, if they are really deprived in an overall setting or not. So that will be a completely different community, which we will find in all countries. Maybe, for example, in Austria, we do find it less to reach out to that community. Romania may find it a little bit easier with the Roma community, which is not much bigger, to get an insight in these kind of communities.
So may I continue? May I continue?
Sure, please.
Because you talked about the Roma community and Romania. It's not only about Romania, it's also about children living in families who are a little bit more deprived, who don't have each of the children their own bedroom, and who don't have each of the children their own devices. But they are not necessarily living in a Roma community, in the most deprived community. So it's a lot of negotiation between children and parents and among children themselves. And what is specific for these families who are poorer or have a smaller number of devices in the homes is the distance between parents and children. So because parents are not so competent, and children often are more competent with digital devices, children take the lead. So they become more active. And you can see while you hear them that these competencies are valued in the family. So they have more freedom, more liberty to decide what they do, how they do, because for parents, it's difficult to moderate what they do. So perhaps you all mentioned that the parents try to limit the time children spend on the internet. It's not only because they are not interested in the content, but for them it's difficult to follow the content. So again, it's a proof of children taking the lead, of negotiation, taking the lead, of looking for the size they are able to use. So this is my observations from Romania. Thank you.
Maybe just one hint for Sonia as well. So sorry, Mrs. Hu. We only look at the family. So there may be interesting results for you as well in terms of civic participation of children which will be older. This is done in another project, in another work package, in work package 6, which basically looks for 15 years and up and what kind of their civic participation is. And we also have a work package on looking at the area of school, how is school have changed and developed. This is more alongside what Mrs. Hu did.
Oh, hello. I'd like to answer the third question regarding to the student personalities. We didn't measure the student personalities in our study. We measured their self-regulated learning, including self-efficacy for reaching goals, motivations, and so on. And also in your question, you mentioned those introverts might do better. The better for online learning, but here we need to be careful how to define better. So in our sense, we observed an increase in self-efficacy. So in that sense, we do observe this betterness improvement. So we may yeah, thank you for your suggestion. We may look into like what kind of students actually have more improvement on that. I'd like to also respond to Professor Livingstone's questions, like how digital technology can support children's well-being. I can think of, based on our study, I can think of immediately two ways, two aspects. One is social connectedness. So with digital devices, we can more conveniently connect with other people. And another is the sedentary behaviors. So we found that the students sat a lot during the pandemic. So if we can use a digital device to encourage them to do more physical exercise, like for example, watching some videos and follow the video to do some exercise at home, this will be immediately helpful for their well-being. Thank you.
Okay,
If I also, okay, can I also comment?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, I would like to respond to Professor Livingstone's remarks. One was about addiction. I'm pretty sure these small children are not addicted. They don't meet the criteria of addiction. That's why I put the question, is it awareness or is it moral panic? And one of my PhD students I supervise, he's not part of DigiGen project, but his main subject is social media addiction. And he did a study and found out that the students think they are addicted, but actually, if you measure it, they are not so much addicted. They use the time, those are behind the screen, but the time is not the most important thing. But what they do is the most important thing. And the moral panic is it's amplified by media. Media is a core component of moral panic. So very often children talk like this because they have heard it from their parents. Parents have read it in the media, and what is the truth? It's not quite sure. And the second thing I wanted to reflect is that within DigiGen project, we have several work packages. Today, we reflected the results of family work package. But if we looked at the data collected in family work package and education work package and also civic participation work package, then we noticed interesting differences how children reflect their relationships with their parents, that within education, they perceive their parents really supportive and helpful, and that they have good relation with parents in terms of using digital technologies. In family life, it's less, and it's so to say heartbreaking if we go to civic participation, that they have so many disagreements with parents in terms of how tolerant should people be towards minorities and so on. So we are now planning to put these results somehow together to understand how in different sectors the parent-child relationship in terms of using digital devices, the technologies can be so different. Thank you.
But I would like to add here, Marika, as well, that we're looking at very different age differences. So in civic participation, we're looking 15 up. In school, we're looking 10 years up. And we in the family work package looking really under the 8 and younger ones. And I think this is very important to have in mind because we have less experience with these very young age groups. And for me, again, to what Marika said, to the addiction, what Sonja mentioned, I still think it's very interesting to see that even the 5 to 6-year-old ones have in their mind that you can get addicted to it. And it's just a way of how we approach children with digital technologies. We all have questioned our societal approach to that new technologies. If children already know in that age group, you may get addicted. So attend that with a negative approach instead of sharing what it all brings together and what kind of opportunities we are having. So I think we have to have that in mind, and we have to balance it a bit more.
Okay, I see that Dr. Vogel just wants to add something, and this will be the last comment or question, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I just add to this. I think it's not so much about other children right or wrong, or do I agree with them or do I not agree with them, because the purpose with the qualitative work in this work package, in my understanding at least, is to get an understanding of what they think and not to judge are they right or are they wrong, because their understanding of what does it mean to be addicted might be totally different from our understanding of being addicted. However, their understanding is relevant for their behavior, for the framing of what they do, and within the family context. So exploring their understanding, for me, from my point of view, is the core thing we're doing, and not so much judging is this incongruence with the societal understanding and context.
Thank you. I think this was a very good last point. So we have reached the end of the seminar. I would like to again thank everyone for, in particular the presenters, for these very interesting two presentations, and also Professor Livingstone, and the audience for the comments and questions that were raised. This was the last seminar in our DC Plus seminar series before the summer break. And as I said before, we will be back in the fall. So please check back late August or early September on our website. And I wish everyone a joyful summer. Thank you, and enjoy your summer.